The morning fog clung to the remote shooting range in Beacon Harbor, Maine, like a gray shroud hiding secrets. Rachel Morgan stepped out of her weathered Honda Civic, her movements deliberately ordinary as she surveyed the nearly empty facility. At 34, she had perfected the art of being forgettable faded jeans, a plain gray hoodie, and a baseball cap pulled low over brown hair that needed a trim. Nothing about her suggested she was anything more than another weekend shooter looking to improve her aim. Frank Sullivan, the range safety officer, watched from his booth as Rachel approached the check-in window. 22 years in the Navy, followed by a decade running this place, had given him an eye for reading people. Most shooters fit into predictable categories: hunters preparing for the season, competitive shooters with their expensive gear, weekend warriors playing tactical games, or the occasional law enforcement officer getting practice time. This woman didn't fit any category he knew. First time here? Frank asked as Rachel signed the waiver with a neat, controlled signature that revealed nothing about her identity beyond the name R. Morgan. Yes, sir. Heard this was a good place for long-distance work. Her voice was soft but carried an undertone of respect that made Frank instinctively straighten his posture. We've got lanes out to 800 yards. You planning to shoot that far today? He studied her slight frame, noting calloused hands that spoke of serious training. We'll see how it goes. Rachel paid in cash, exact change, and headed toward the equipment area. Frank's curiosity deepened as he watched her methodically select her lane, the farthest one from the main building, offering the most privacy and the best sight lines to multiple exit routes. The rifle case she carried was unmarked, expensive looking, and handled with the care of someone who knew precision equipment. When she began assembling her weapon, Frank found himself leaning forward in his chair. The rifle wasn't anything he recognized from standard military or civilian catalogs. Custom work, clearly, with modifications that suggested serious money and specialized knowledge. More intriguing was how she assembled it. No wasted movements, no checking the manual. Each component fitted with the muscle memory of someone who had done this thousands of times in conditions where seconds mattered. "Hey, Frank," called Tommy Brennan, a local hunter who'd been coming to the range for 15 years. "You see that lady at the end lane? Something's not right about her setup." Frank raised his binoculars and focused on Rachel's position. She had assumed a prone shooting stance that was textbook perfect, but it was her breathing pattern that caught his attention. 4-count inhale, hold, controlled exhale on the trigger pull. Military precision, but more refined than standard training. Special operations refined. The first shot rang out, and Frank immediately swung his spotting scope to the 400-yard target. Dead center. Without adjusting her scope or changing position, Rachel shifted to the 600-yard target. Another perfect center hit, then 700 yards. Bullseye. "That's impossible," Tommy muttered, standing beside Frank's booth. At that distance, was no wind flags, no spotting scope. Nobody shoots that clean without equipment. But Rachel was reading the wind. Frank could see her observing the grass movement, the way dust drifted near the targets, the subtle shifts in the tree line that indicated air currents. She was making calculations in her head that most competitive shooters needed computers to figure out. As the morning progressed, other shooters began to notice. Rachel continued her methodical precision, hitting targets at distances that should have required multiple adjustment shots, spotting equipment, and years of competitive experience. Yet she worked alone with minimal gear and never missed. "Frank, this is making people nervous," said Detective Marcus Wells, who had stopped by for his monthly qualification shoot. "That level of accuracy isn't normal. And she's got no ID. Badge visible, no range officer supervision for those distances." Frank felt a familiar tension in his gut, the same instinct that had kept him alive during 2 submarine deployments. Something significant was happening here. but he couldn't identify the threat. The woman was following all safety protocols. Her weapon handling was exemplary, and she hadn't spoken to anyone or caused any disturbance. Yet every military instinct he possessed was telling him she was far more than she appeared. "Maybe we should check her credentials," Wells suggested, his hand unconsciously resting near his service weapon. That kind of precision. It's either world-class competitive shooting or military special operations training. And if it's military, why is she here alone without any official presence? Rachel seemed to sense the attention. Without turning around, she began packing her equipment with the same methodical precision she'd shown throughout the morning. But Frank noticed something that made his blood run cold. As she moved, her eyes constantly tracked the positions of every person at the range, calculated the distance to exits, and evaluated potential cover positions. It wasn't paranoia. It was operational awareness. "Detective," Frank said quietly, "I think you might want to approach her carefully. Something tells me there's more to this story than we're seeing." As Wells walked toward Rachel's position, Frank reached for his phone. He had a contact at the Pentagon, an old Navy buddy who worked in personnel security. If this woman was who his instincts suggested she might be, they were about to make a very serious mistake. But before he could dial, Rachel had calmly turned to face Detective Wells, her hands visible and non-threatening, waiting with the patience of someone who had been expecting this moment all along. Detective Marcus Wells approached the shooting lane with measured steps, his 20 years of law enforcement experience telling him to be cautious but not aggressive. The woman Rachel Morgan, according to the sign-in sheet, watched his approach with calm eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of his movement, his equipment, and the positions of everyone else at the range. "Excuse me, ma'am," Wells said, stopping about 6 feet away with his hands visible. "I'm Detective Wells with the Beacon Harbor Police. I'd like to ask you a few questions about your shooting today." Rachel set down her cleaning kit and turned to face him fully, her posture relaxed but alert. "Is there a problem, Detective?" "Well, your accuracy is quite impressive. Some folks here are wondering about your background, your training level. This kind of precision usually comes with official credentials, military, law enforcement, competitive shooting circuits. Could I see some identification and any permits for that rifle?" Wells expected the usual response, a wallet produced with a concealed carry permit, maybe a military ID or competitive shooting association credentials. Instead, Rachel's expression remained perfectly neutral as she replied, "I don't have those documents with me today. Ma'am, I need to see some form of identification. And that rifle, it's not a standard civilian model. I'm going to need to see registration and permits." Rachel's silence stretched long enough to make Wells uncomfortable. He radioed for backup not because she seemed threatening, but because something about this situation felt far outside his normal experience. Within minutes, officers Jake Peterson and Maria Santos arrived, their presence adding weight to what had started as a routine inquiry. "Ma'am, we're going to need you to come with us for questioning," Wells said. "Refusal to provide identification is a misdemeanor in Maine, and we need to verify the legal status of that weapon." What happened next would haunt Wells for months afterward. Rachel didn't argue, didn't protest, didn't demand to speak to a lawyer or assert her rights. She simply nodded, methodically secured her weapon in its case, and held out her hands for handcuffs with a compliance that somehow felt more unsettling than resistance would have been. As they walked toward the patrol car, Wells noticed that Rachel's eyes never stopped moving. She was reading the landscape, noting vehicle positions, identifying cover points, calculating distances to the tree line. It wasn't the behavior of someone planning escape. It was the automatic awareness of someone trained to survive in hostile territory. "You military?" Officer Peterson asked as they secured her in the back seat. Something like that, Rachel replied quietly, speaking for the first time since her arrest. Frank Sullivan watched from his booth as the police cars pulled away, and growing sense of unease settling in his stomach. He dialed his Pentagon contact immediately. "Jim, it's Frank Sullivan in Maine. I need you to run a quiet check on someone. A woman, mid-30s, extraordinary marksmanship skills. Just got arrested at my range for not having ID. Something's not right about this whole situation. Frank, you know, I can't just run background checks on civilians. Jim, I spent 2 decades in submarines learning to trust my instincts. This woman isn't a civilian. The way she moved, the way she handled her weapon, the way she submitted to arrest. She's one of ours, or she's someone we need to know about immediately." At the Beacon Harbor Police Station, the booking process revealed more questions than answers. Rachel's fingerprints didn't match any local or state databases. She carried no wallet, no phone, no personal identification of any kind. Just a key card with no visible markings and a small notebook filled with what appeared to be GPS coordinates. "Look, Ms. Morgan, if that's your real name you're making this a lot harder than it needs to be," said Detective Wells during the initial interview. "We can hold you for 48 hours on the identification issue alone. Add in the unregistered weapon, and you're looking at federal charges. Just tell us who you are and what you were doing at that range." Rachel sat with perfect posture, her hands folded calmly in her lap, and said nothing. But Wells noticed that she was memorizing every detail of the interview room camera positions, door locations, the timing of guard rotations outside. This wasn't someone planning an escape. This was someone conducting an assessment. Hours passed. Different officers tried different approaches: friendly conversation, implied threats, promises of cooperation deals. Rachel responded to each with the same respectful silence, occasionally accepting offered water or coffee, but never wavering from her refusal to identify herself. "Maybe she's foreign intelligence," suggested Officer Santos during a break. "Russian, Chinese. Someone trained not to break under interrogation." "Or maybe she's ours," Wells replied, remembering the woman's automatic military bearing. "And we're about to cause an international incident by holding one of our own special operators." The breakthrough came when Rookie Officer David Kim brought Rachel dinner. As she reached for the water glass, her sleeve rode up slightly, revealing a distinctive scar on her wrist, a precise, surgical-looking mark that Kim recognized from his brother's Navy SEAL training stories. "That's a rope-burn scar," Kim told Wells privately. "My brother has one just like it from helicopter fast rope training, but that particular shape." He said only the most elite units do that kind of high-speed insertion work. Wells stared through the one-way glass at their prisoner, who sat with unshakable calm despite facing serious charges. She wasn't breaking because she didn't need to break. She was waiting for something or someone. His phone rang at 11:47 p.m. The caller ID showed a Washington, D.C. area code. "Detective Wells? This is Captain Jennifer Hayes, Navy personnel. Command, I understand you have someone in custody who may be of interest to us. I'm going to need you to maintain current security protocols until further notice. Someone will be in touch tomorrow morning." "Captain, can you tell me, detective, just maintain current status. And detective? No media contact, no outside communication about this arrest. This is now a matter of national security." As Wells hung up, he looked again at the woman sitting calmly in interview room 2. Rachel Morgan, if that was her name, hadn't moved in hours. She wasn't pacing, wasn't demanding her phone call, wasn't showing any signs of stress or fear. She was waiting. And somehow, Wells knew that tomorrow would bring answers he wasn't prepared to handle. The morning of Rachel's arraignment brought unprecedented attention to the small courthouse in Beacon Harbor. Word had somehow leaked about the mysterious woman with impossible shooting skills, and reporters from Portland and Boston had descended on the usually quiet coastal town. Detective Wells arrived early, hoping to get answers before the media circus reached full intensity. "Any word from your Navy contact?" asked Chief Rebecca Martinez as they reviewed the case file one more time. "Nothing since last night. But I've got a feeling we're in deeper than we realized." Wells pointed to Rachel's booking photo. "Look at her expression. That's not fear or defiance. That's patience. Like she knows something we don't." In her holding cell, Rachel had spent the night in what appeared to be meditation, sitting perfectly still for hours at a time. The guards reported that she never seemed to actually sleep, but remained alert and aware of every sound, every movement in the facility. When breakfast arrived, she ate methodically, thanked the officer politely, and returned to her vigilant calm. Public Defender Jennifer Walsh arrived looking harried and overwhelmed. At 52, she'd handled thousands of cases, but nothing had prepared her for a client who refused to speak, wouldn't provide any background information, and seemed completely unconcerned about facing serious federal charges. "Ms. Morgan, I need you to understand the seriousness of your situation," Walsh said during their brief pretrial meeting. "Possession of an unregistered weapon, refusal to identify yourself to law enforcement, and now Homeland Security is talking about potential terrorism charges. You need to tell me something, anything, that can help me defend you." Rachel studied her court-appointed attorney with the same measuring gaze she'd given everyone else. "I appreciate your concern, Ms. Walsh. Please do whatever you think is best. That's not how this works. I can't defend someone who won't tell me who they are or why they were at that shooting range. The prosecution is going to paint you as a security threat, and without any background information, I have no way to counter that narrative." For the first time since her arrest, Rachel's expression softened slightly. Sometimes the best defense is patience. The courthouse began filling early, despite the morning's proceedings being routine arraignments. Frank Sullivan took a seat in the back, his unease growing as he noticed several men in dark suits positioned strategically around the room. These weren't local law enforcement or typical court personnel. They moved with the efficient awareness of federal agents or military intelligence. Judge Eleanor Harrison reviewed her docket with visible irritation. 40 years on the bench had taught her to recognize when a simple case was about to become complicated, and everything about this morning felt wrong. The media attention, the federal agents, the mysterious defendant who had somehow become the focus of national security. Concerns, none of it belonged in her small-town courtroom. "Your Honor," began Assistant District Attorney Michael Ross, "the state charges the defendant with possession of an unregistered firearm, refusal to identify herself to law enforcement, and creating a public disturbance. Given the defendant's refusal to provide identification and the unusual circumstances of her arrest, the state requests remand without bail pending federal investigation." Before Public Defender Walsh could respond, a man in a dark suit stood near the back of the courtroom. "Your Honor, Agent Robert Stevens, Homeland Security. The federal government requests immediate transfer of custody pending investigation of potential threats to national security." Another suited figure rose from the opposite side of the gallery. "Your Honor, Special Agent Lisa Chang, FBI. We have jurisdiction in this matter as it relates to an ongoing counterterrorism investigation." Judge Harrison banged her gavel sharply. "Gentlemen, this is still my courtroom. We will proceed with the arraignment, and then I will consider any jurisdictional arguments." She looked down at Rachel, who sat with perfect posture beside her increasingly flustered public defender. "How does the defendant plead to the charges of possession of an unregistered firearm and failure to identify?" Before Walsh could speak, the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung open with a resonance that seemed to silence every conversation. A Navy admiral in full dress uniform entered, his medals catching the morning light streaming through the tall windows. Behind him walked two other officers, their bearing unmistakably military. The transformation in the courtroom was immediate and dramatic. Every veteran present, including Frank Sullivan, two bailiffs, several court officers, and even Agent Stevens, instinctively stood at attention. Judge Harrison, herself a former JAG officer, straightened in her chair with obvious recognition of the Admiral's authority. Admiral William Thompson walked directly down the center aisle without seeking permission or acknowledgement from the court. His presence commanded absolute attention as he approached the bench and handed a sealed envelope to the bailiff, who delivered it to Judge Harrison with unusual deference. As the judge broke the official seal and read the documents inside, her expression shifted from annoyance to surprise to grave understanding. The courtroom remained silent, tension building as everyone waited for an explanation that would make sense of the morning's events. Finally, Judge Harrison looked up, her voice carrying new weight and authority. In light of classified documentation from the Department of Defense, all charges against the defendant are hereby dismissed, effective immediately. This case is now classified under national security protocols. She banged her gavel with finality. Court is adjourned. The courtroom erupted in confused murmurs and urgent whispers as Admiral Thompson approached the defendant's table. For the first time since her arrest, Rachel Morgan spoke clearly, her voice carrying across the room despite its softness. "Admiral Thompson, I apologize for any inconvenience this situation may have caused." The Admiral's response sent shockwaves through everyone present. On the contrary, "Commander Hayes, the United States Navy apologizes to you." At the word "Commander," every military person in the courtroom, including Frank Sullivan, Agent Stevens, and the court bailiffs, snapped to attention with obvious respect and recognition. Detective Wells watched in amazement as the unremarkable woman he had arrested transformed before his eyes, no longer hiding her military bearing and natural command presence. Judge Harrison herself stood and offered a respectful nod to both the Admiral and Rachel. "Thank you both for your understanding of this situation." "Thank you for your discretion, Your Honor," Admiral Thompson replied. "Commander Hayes has been operating under classified orders." The situation required absolute operational security. As they prepared to leave the courtroom, Detective Wells approached them, his mind racing with questions and the growing realization that he had been completely wrong about everything. "Admiral, with respect, my department deserves some explanation. We've been treating this as a potential security threat for over 24 hours. Admiral Thompson studied Wells with the measuring gaze of someone accustomed to evaluating people quickly and accurately. "Detective, Commander Hayes is one of our most decorated special operations officers. The details of her current assignment remain classified, but I can assure you that she poses no threat to your community. Quite the opposite, in fact." As they walked toward the courthouse exit, Frank Sullivan stepped forward. "Commander Hayes?" When she turned, he continued, 20 years Navy myself. Submarines. I knew there was something familiar about how you carried yourself yesterday." Rachel shook his hand with genuine warmth. "Thank you for your service and for your discretion. Your instincts served you well." Outside the courthouse, as black SUVs waited to transport Rachel and the Admiral, Detective Wells realized that his understanding of law enforcement, military operations, and national security had been fundamentally changed by the past 24 hours. He had arrested one of America's most elite warriors, and she had submitted to handcuffs and detention rather than compromise whatever mission had brought her to their small Maine town. The last thing he heard as the vehicles pulled away was Admiral Thompson's voice. "Commander, Washington is waiting for your debrief on Operation Silent Harbor." Your cover held perfectly, even under detention. Wells stood on the courthouse steps, finally understanding that Rachel Morgan, Commander Hayes, had never been a mysterious threat at all. She had been exactly where she needed to be, doing exactly what she needed to do, and even arrest and imprisonment had been part of her mission parameters. The real question wasn't who she was. It was what threat had been so serious that it required one of America's most elite operators to maintain her cover even at the cost of her own freedom. The debriefing room at Naval Station Brunswick was windowless and sterile, designed for conversations that would never appear in official records. Admiral Thompson sat across from Commander Alexandra. Hayes, her real name finally revealed, while 3 other officers in civilian clothes took notes on laptops that would be wiped clean within hours. "Commander, walk us through the past 18 months, Admiral Thompson said, activating a recording device that bore the highest security classifications. From the beginning, Rachel Alexandra sat with the same composed bearing she'd maintained throughout her arrest, but now her military identity was no longer hidden. Operation Silent Harbor began in February of last year. Intelligence indicated a coordinated domestic terrorism threat targeting major eastern seaboard ports. The cell had connections to foreign operatives, but was primarily composed of American citizens with military training. And your cover identity? Rachel Morgan, recently divorced, relocating to Maine for a fresh start. I established residency in Beacon Harbor, took a job at the marina, and began integrating into the local community. The shooting range was part of maintaining my skills, while appearing to be a civilian amateur shooter, gradually improving her accuracy. Commander James Mitchell, the operations intelligence officer, leaned forward. The arrest wasn't planned? No, sir. My cover identity was designed to withstand casual scrutiny, not police investigation. Detective Wells noticed inconsistencies in my shooting ability that couldn't be explained by civilian training. The arrest was an unplanned variable that required immediate adaptation. Admiral Thompson nodded grimly. And you chose to maintain cover even under detention rather than reveal your identity. Yes, sir. The terrorist cell had infiltrated local government and law enforcement in 3 coastal towns. If word had leaked that a Navy special operator was conducting surveillance in the area, 18 months of intelligence gathering would have been compromised. The targets would have scattered, and we would have lost our only opportunity to prevent the attack. The room fell silent as the magnitude of her decision settled in. Alexandra had risked federal charges, imprisonment, and potentially her entire career to protect an operation that could save thousands of lives. Tell us about the final phase, Admiral Thompson requested. 3 days after my release, we identified the final target, Portsmouth Naval Shipyard. During the commissioning ceremony for USS Maine, the terrorist cell planned to detonate a truck bomb during the event. When over 2,000 military personnel and civilian dignitaries would be present, including the Secretary of Defense and several foreign naval attaches. Commander Lisa Park, the operations tactical coordinator, consulted her notes. How did the arrest situation actually help the mission? Alexandra allowed herself a small smile. The media attention from the mysterious woman at the shooting range actually provided perfect cover. While local and national news were focused on speculation about my identity, my team was able to move into final surveillance positions unnoticed. The terrorists were watching the news like everyone else, completely unaware that the person they were seeing on television was the same operative who had been tracking them for a year and a half. The final takedown? Coordinated operation between Navy SEALs, FBI hostage rescue team, and local law enforcement. 7 arrests, complete intelligence seizure, and prevention of what would have been the largest domestic terrorism attack since 9/11. Alexandra's voice remained level, but there was quiet pride in her accomplishment. 0 casualties on our sighed, and the public never knew how close we came to catastrophe. Admiral Thompson closed his folder. Commander Hayes, your actions during Operation Silent Harbor represent the highest traditions of naval special warfare. Your willingness to endure arrest and potential imprisonment to maintain operational security likely saved thousands of lives. Thank you, sir. I was just doing my job. Very few people could have maintained cover under that level of scrutiny. Detective Wells was extremely thorough in his investigation. He was, sir. He's a good cop who was doing exactly what he should have done given the information available to him. In fact, double quotes, Alexandra paused thoughtfully. I'd like to recommend Detective Wells for recruitment consideration. His investigative instincts and attention to detail are exceptional. Meanwhile, back in Beacon Harbor, Detective Wells was struggling to process everything he'd learned. Chief Martinez found him at his desk at 6 a.m., staring at reports he'd been reading all night. Marcus, go home. Get some sleep. This case is closed. Chief, I arrested a Navy SEAL. One of our most elite special operators submitted to handcuffs and detention rather than blow her cover. Do you understand what that means? It means she's better at her job than we could have imagined. Wells looked up, exhaustion and awe battling in his expression. For 18 months, she was living right here in our town, working at Peterson's Marina, shopping at the same grocery store as my wife, probably saw her at the hardware store or the coffee shop. And all that time, she was hunting terrorists who were planning to kill thousands of people. Chief Martinez sat down across from him. Marcus, people like Commander Hayes operate in a world we can barely comprehend. They make sacrifices and take risks that most of us couldn't handle. The fact that she trusted our system enough to let us arrest her, knowing that eventually the truth would come out, that says something about her faith in American justice. But what if Admiral Thompson hadn't shown up? What if those federal agents had transferred her before the Navy could intervene? Then she would have found another way to complete her mission. People like her always do. Wells's phone rang, interrupting his brooding. The caller ID showed a Washington, D.C. number he didn't recognize. Detective Wells? This is Admiral Thompson. I believe we should talk. 3 days after the courtroom revelation, Detective Wells received a call that would change his life forever. Admiral Thompson's voice on the phone carried the same authority that had transformed the Beacon Harbor courthouse. But now there was a tone of recruitment rather than command. Detective, I'd like to meet with you privately. There are opportunities within Naval Criminal Investigative Service that might interest someone with your particular skills and experience. Wells found himself driving to a nondescript office building in Portland, where Admiral Thompson waited with Commander Hayes and 2 other officers he didn't recognize. The meeting room looked like any corporate conference space, but the conversation that followed was unlike anything in his law enforcement career. Detective, your handling of the Commander Hayes situation demonstrated exceptional investigative instincts, Admiral Thompson began. You identified inconsistencies that most people would have missed, pursued the investigation methodically despite unusual circumstances, and maintained operational security even when you didn't understand why it was necessary. Commander Hayes spoke for the first time since entering the room. Detective Wells, you did everything right. Your thoroughness and professionalism made my job more difficult in the short term, but ultimately helped ensure the mission's success. That kind of attention to detail is rare. Ma'am, I still feel like I should apologize. Don't. Her voice carried quiet authority. You saw something that didn't fit standard patterns and investigated appropriately. That's exactly what good law enforcement should do. It's also exactly what we need in NCIS. Commander Robert Chun, whom Admiral Thompson introduced as an NCIS unit chief, spread several folders across the table. Detective, We're expanding our liaison program with local law enforcement along the eastern seaboard. Recent events have shown us that military special operations increasingly intersect with civilian jurisdictions. We need people who understand both worlds. Wells studied the materials, his excitement growing as he realized the scope of what they were offering. This would involve working with special operations units directly. Among other things, Admiral Thompson confirmed counterterrorism, foreign intelligence threats, protection of classified military assets, and coordination between military operations and civilian law enforcement. It's challenging work, often in ambiguous situations where the rules aren't clearly defined. Like arresting a Navy SEAL at a shooting range? Commander Hayes smiled. Exactly like that. Except next time, you be the one making sure local authorities understand what they're dealing with without compromising ongoing operations. The conversation continued for 2 hours, covering everything from security clearances to relocation requirements to the types of cases Wells would handle. As they prepared to leave, Admiral Thompson handed him a final folder. Take your time deciding, Detective. But understand that people with your investigative abilities and judgment are rare. Commander Hayes specifically requested that we approach you for this position. That evening, Wells sat in his kitchen with his wife Karen, explaining the opportunity as completely as security requirements allowed. 20 years of marriage had taught her to read his expressions, and she could see his excitement despite his attempts to remain analytical. You want to take it, she said simply. I think I do. But it means leaving Beacon Harbor, leaving everything we've built here. Karen reached across the table and took his hand. Marcus, for the past 3 days you've talked about nothing except how much you learned from this case. How it opened your eyes to a world you never knew existed. When was the last time you felt challenged by your work here? Wells considered her question honestly. It's been years since I felt like I was making a real difference. Most of our cases here are routine domestic disputes, minor theft, traffic violations. Important work, but this would be protecting national security. Working with people like Commander Hayes to prevent terrorist attacks and save lives. 2 weeks later, Wells submitted his resignation to the Beacon Harbor Police Department and accepted the NCIS position. His farewell party at the police station was bittersweet colleagues who had become family over 13 years. Cases that had defined his career. A community that had shaped his identity as a law enforcement officer. Chief Martinez pulled him aside during the celebration. Marcus, I'm proud of you for taking this opportunity. But I need to know, are you leaving because you're running towards something or running away from small-town policing? Running toward something, Chief. Definitely running toward something. On his last day, Wells drove out to the shooting range where everything had started. Frank Sullivan was there early, as always, preparing for the day's customers. Heard you're heading to the big leagues, Frank said, shaking Wells's hand firmly. Thanks to you recognizing that something wasn't right about Commander Hayes. Your instinct started the whole chain of events, Frank chuckled. 20 years in submarines teaches you to pay attention to details that don't fit. Speaking of which ... He handed Wells a business card with only a phone number. Commander Hayes asked me to give you this. Said you might need it someday. What is it? Emergency contact. For times when local law enforcement encounters something that might be military related, but they're not sure. You'll be the liaison, the person who can make the right calls and ensure everyone stays safe. Wells pocketed the card, understanding that he was now part of a network he had never known existed. People like Frank, with their quiet expertise and careful observations. People like Commander Hayes, operating in shadows to protect freedoms most Americans took for granted. And now people like him, serving as bridges between the visible world of civilian law enforcement and the invisible world of Special Operations. As he drove away from Beacon Harbor for the last time as a resident, Wells thought about the chain of events that had begun with a woman hitting impossible targets at a shooting range. His arrest of Commander Hayes had been simultaneously the biggest mistake and the best decision of his law enforcement career. His phone buzzed with a text from an unlisted number. "Welcome to the team, Detective. Looking forward to working with you." Wells smiled, knowing that his real education was just beginning. Somewhere in America, elite operators were conducting missions that would never make the news, preventing threats that the public would never know existed. And now he would be part of the system that supported them, ensuring that the next time someone like Commander Hayes needed to maintain cover, the proper protocols would be in place to protect both the operation and the local authorities doing their jobs. The adventure was just beginning. 6 months later, Detective Wells, now Special Agent Wells, stood on the deck of a Coast Guard cutter off the coast of Virginia, watching the sunrise paint the Atlantic in shades of gold and crimson. His first major assignment with NCIS had brought him full circle, investigating reports of unusual activity at a private shooting range near Norfolk Naval Base. "Agent Wells," called Commander Hayes, approaching from the communications center. She wore civilian clothes but moved with the fluid efficiency he remembered from their first encounter. "We've got confirmation. 3 individuals with extraordinary marksmanship abilities, no official identification, and weapon systems that don't appear in any civilian database." "Sounds familiar," Wells replied with a slight smile. "Any chance they're ours?" That's what we need to determine." The range owner, a retired Marine named Jack Peterson, called the NCIS hotline after remembering the protocols we established following your experience with me. Instead of calling local police, he reached out to us directly. Wells nodded, appreciating how their previous case had created systems to prevent similar misunderstandings. "What's the tactical situation?" 3 unknowns, extraordinary skill. Level, unregistered weapons, and complete operational security. They've been at the range for 4 hours, hitting targets at distances that suggest advanced military training. But here's the interesting part. They're not trying to hide their abilities like I was. They're demonstrating them openly. "Commander." Chun joined them on deck, carrying surveillance equipment and tactical gear. "Agent Wells, we need you to make the initial approach. Your experience with Commander Hayes gives you unique credibility in situations like this." As they prepared to move to shore, Wells reflected on how much his life had changed. 6 months of NCIS training had taught him about threats he had never imagined, operations conducted in shadows, and the complex world where military and civilian jurisdictions intersected. But more importantly, it had taught him to recognize the signs of professional operators and distinguish between threats and allies. The shooting range outside Norfolk was larger than Frank Sullivan's facility in Maine, with multiple buildings and training areas that suggested serious money and professional management. Jack Peterson met them at the main entrance, his Marine bearing immediately evident despite civilian clothes. "Agent Wells? I'm Jack Peterson. Thanks for responding so quickly." "Mr. Peterson, walk us through what you observed." 3 individuals arrived at 0500 before official opening hours. Military-style vehicles, professional-grade equipment, and shooting skills that are off the charts. They've been here 4 hours, working through long-distance precision exercises that would challenge Olympic-level competitive shooters. Wells studied the range through binoculars, watching 3 figures at the farthest positions. Even from a distance, their movements showed the controlled efficiency of advanced military training. Any communication with them? Minimal. They paid in cash, signed waivers with first names only, and asked for the most isolated lanes available. Polite, professional, but clearly not interested in conversation. Commander Hayes appeared beside them, her own binoculars focused on the shooters. "Agent Wells, take a look at their weapon maintenance routine." Wells adjusted his focus and immediately understood her concern. The three shooters were cleaning and maintaining their rifles with the methodical precision of people whose lives depended on weapon reliability. This wasn't recreational shooting. This was operational preparation. "Commander, recommendations?" "Direct approach, but prepared for multiple scenarios. They could be foreign intelligence, domestic threats, or our own people conducting training we're not aware of. Your job is to determine which category they fit into without compromising security or triggering a confrontation." Wells felt the familiar tension of approaching an unknown situation, but this time he had the training and support structure to handle it properly. As he walked toward the shooting positions, he noticed that all three individuals had stopped firing and were watching his approach with alert attention. "Good morning," Wells called out when he was still 20 feet away, his hands visible and his posture non-threatening. "I'm Agent Wells with NCIS. Mind if I ask you folks a few questions?" The closest shooter, a woman in her late 20s with the lean build of someone in exceptional physical condition, set down her rifle and turned to face him. "Agent Wells, we've been expecting someone from your office." The unexpected response caught Wells off guard. "You've been expecting us?" "Yes, sir. We're here for equipment testing and qualification updates. Our unit coordinator was supposed to arrange clearance with local NCIS, but there may have been a communication breakdown." Wells felt his investigative instincts activate. The woman's response was plausible, but evasive, acknowledging official status without providing specific identification. "I'll need to see some credentials and verify your unit authorization." The second shooter, a tall man with gray at his temples, approached with his hands visible. "Agent Wells, we're operating under compartmented protocols. Our identification and mission details need to be verified through secure channels rather than field presentation." "Sir, I understand operational security requirements, but I still need some form of verification that you're authorized to be here." The third member of the group, a younger man who had been observing silently, spoke up. "Agent Wells, if you could contact Captain Jennifer Hayes at Navy Personnel Command, she can provide verification codes for our unit status." Wells paused, recognizing the name. Captain Hayes, Commander Hayes, had been promoted and transferred to a Pentagon position. "I'll make that call, but I need you all to secure your weapons and remain in position while I verify your status." As Wells stepped away to make the secure call, he noticed that the three individuals began packing their equipment with the same methodical efficiency Commander Hayes had shown. Whatever the outcome of his verification call, they were prepared to move quickly. "Captain Hayes," came the familiar voice when his call connected to the Pentagon. "Captain, this is Agent Wells. Sieges. I'm at a shooting range near Norfolk with three individuals who claim to be conducting official testing. They suggested I contact you for verification." A pause. "Agent Wells, what are their designation codes?" Wells returned to the group. "The captain needs your designation codes for verification." The woman replied immediately, "Sierra 7 Alpha, Echo 3 Charlie, and Delta 9 Bravo." Wells relayed the codes and waited. Captain Hayes' response solved the mystery. "Agent Wells, those are members of a classified assessment unit. Their presence at civilian facilities is part of ongoing evaluation protocols. You can clear them for continued operations." "Understood." "Captain, are there any special security requirements I should be aware of?" "Just ensure range security and prevent unauthorized observation of their capabilities." "And Agent Wells?" "Good work on the proper verification procedures. That's exactly the kind of thoroughness we need in the field." As Wells ended the call, he realized that this case represented exactly why NCIS had recruited him. Military Special Operations units regularly operated in civilian spaces, conducting training and assessments that could easily be misinterpreted as security threats. His job was to serve as the bridge between worlds, ensuring that legitimate operations could continue while protecting against actual threats. "You're cleared to continue your exercises," Wells told the group. "I'll coordinate with range management to ensure your privacy." The woman who had spoken first extended her hand. "Thank you, Agent Wells. We appreciate the professional handling of this situation. Just doing my job." "Though I have to ask, are encounters like this common?" "More common than most people realize," the older man replied. "People with our skill sets need regular training and assessment. Sometimes that happens at facilities like this one, and sometimes it raises questions from observant citizens or law enforcement." Wells understood. And sometimes those questions need to be answered by people who understand both sides of the equation. Exactly. As Wells prepared to leave, the younger member of the group approached him privately. "Agent Wells, we heard about your situation with Commander Hayes in Maine. Your handling of that case is why protocols like today's exist. Sometimes one good investigation prevents dozens of future misunderstandings." Driving back to NCI's headquarters, Wells reflected on how his career had evolved. 6 months ago, he had been arresting someone he thought was a security threat. Today, he had successfully identified and verified a legitimate special operations training exercise. The difference wasn't just his expanded knowledge. It was the existence of protocols and communication channels that allowed military and civilian law enforcement to work together effectively. His phone buzzed with a text from Captain Hayes. "Excellent work today, Agent Wells. This is exactly the kind of professional coordination we envisioned when we recruited you. These situations require someone who understands operational requirements while maintaining security standards." Wells smiled, knowing that he had found his calling in this strange intersection of military operations and civilian law enforcement. Somewhere in America, elite operators were conducting missions that required them to train in civilian facilities, work in local communities, and maintain covers that could easily be misunderstood by well-intentioned law enforcement. His job was to ensure that the next Detective Wells wouldn't have to arrest the next Commander Hayes, because the proper protocols would be in place to protect both the operations and the officers doing their jobs. 2 years after the Commander Hayes incident, Agent Wells had become the East Coast Coordinator for Military-Civilian Law Enforcement Liaison, a position that didn't officially exist but had proven essential for national security. His office in Washington, D.C. was unremarkable from the outside, but inside it served as the nerve center for coordinating between special operations units and local police departments from Maine to Georgia. His phone rang at 6:23 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, never a good sign in his line of work. "Agent Wells, this is Sheriff David Morrison in Cedar Point, North Carolina. We've got a situation that fits your protocols." Wells was immediately alert. Cedar Point was 50 miles from Camp Lejeune, an area where military personnel frequently operated in civilian contexts. "What's the situation, Sheriff?" "We've got reports of unusual activity at an abandoned warehouse complex near the coast. Multiple witnesses describe individuals with military bearing, advanced equipment, and what appears to be tactical vehicles. Local resident called it in as possible terrorist surveillance of the port facility. Have you made contact?" "Not yet. Based on the training your office provided last year, we established a perimeter and called you first rather than approaching directly." Wells smiled grimly. The protocols were working. Sheriff Morrison was following procedures that had been developed specifically to prevent situations like the Commander Hayes arrest from recurring. "I'm en route. Maintain observation but no direct contact until I arrive." The flight to North Carolina gave Wells time to review recent intelligence reports. 3 different special operations units were conducting training exercises along the eastern seaboard, but none were supposed to be operating in the Cedar Point area. That could mean either an unauthorized exercise, a genuine security threat, or a classified operation that hadn't been communicated through normal channels. Sheriff Morrison met him at the small regional airport, his demeanor professional but concerned. "Agent Wells, thanks for coming so quickly. This situation has my entire department on edge." "Sheriff, walk me through everything you've observed." "Started 3 days ago. Local fishermen reported seeing individuals with night vision equipment and what appeared to be military communications gear near the old Maritime Industries complex. Yesterday, a jogger observed tactical vehicles and personnel conducting what looked like surveillance of the Port Authority building. As they drove toward the warehouse complex, Wells noted the strategic significance of the location. Cedar Point's port handled significant military cargo shipments to Camp Leeuwin, making it a potential target for terrorist activity, but also a logical location for security exercises. "Sheriff, have you noticed any other unusual activity in the area? New residents, suspicious vehicles, anything that doesn't fit normal patterns?" "Funny you should ask. We've had 3 new residents move to town in the past month. All paid cash for rental properties, all claimed to be remote workers, but none of them seem to have regular employment. Could be coincidence, but in your experience, there's no such thing as coincidence when it comes to security matters." "Exactly." The warehouse complex sat on 15 acres of waterfront property that had been abandoned for 5 years following the closure of Maritime Industries. Multiple buildings, excellent sightlines to the port, and numerous access routes made it either perfect for terrorist surveillance or ideal for training exercises designed to counter such threats. Wells established a command post in Sheriff Morrison's mobile unit, coordinating with NCI's headquarters while local deputies maintained their perimeter. His first call was to Captain Hayes at the Pentagon. "Captain, Agent Wells, I'm in Cedar Point, North Carolina, investigating possible unauthorized military activity near port facilities. Can you verify whether any of our units are operating in this area?" "Agent Wells, give me 30 minutes to check classified training schedules. In the meantime, maintain your perimeter and treat this as potentially hostile until we know otherwise." While waiting for verification, Wells reviewed satellite imagery of the warehouse complex with Sheriff Morrison. The photos showed clear evidence of recent activity, vehicle tracks, equipment staging areas, and what appeared to be observation positions overlooking the port. "Sheriff, based on the positioning and equipment placement, this operation shows sophisticated planning and extensive resources. Either we're looking at a serious terrorist threat, or this is one of our most advanced special operations units conducting training. How do we tell the difference without potentially compromising either scenario?" Wells's phone rang before he could answer. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, but the voice was familiar. "Agent Wells, this is Colonel Alexandra Hayes. I understand you're investigating activity in the Cedar Point area." Wells felt a mix of relief and concern. Commander Hayes had been promoted to colonel and transferred to an even more classified position, but her involvement suggested this situation was more complex than a simple training exercise. "Colonel Hayes, we've established a perimeter around the warehouse complex. Sheriff Morrison's department has observed what appears to be military personnel conducting surveillance of port facilities. Agent Wells, you're looking at a joint training exercise between Navy SEALs and Marine Force reconnaissance units. However, the exercise has identified actual security vulnerabilities that require immediate attention." "Ma'am, are you saying this started as training but uncovered real threats?" "Affirmative. The exercise was designed to test port security measures, but during the assessment, Our teams identified indicators of actual hostile surveillance. We're now conducting a dual operation, completing the training exercise while simultaneously investigating genuine security concerns. Wells felt the familiar complexity of situations where training, reality, and security intersected in ways that defied simple categorization. Colonel, what do you need from local law enforcement? Continue your perimeter, but expand it to include the 3 rental properties Sheriff Morrison mentioned. We believe the individuals who moved to town recently may be connected to the hostile surveillance we've detected. Over the next 6 hours, Wells coordinated one of the most complex operations of his NCI's career. Local law enforcement maintained outer security while special operations teams completed their assessment of port vulnerabilities. Simultaneously, FBI counterterrorism specialists investigated the suspicious new residents, eventually confirming they were foreign intelligence operatives conducting reconnaissance for a potential attack. By evening, all 3 suspects were in federal custody. The port security weaknesses had been identified and corrected, and the joint training exercise had been completed successfully. Sheriff Morrison's department had played a crucial role without ever knowing the full scope of what they were supporting. Agent Wells, Colonel Hayes said as the operation concluded, this case represents exactly why the liaison program exists. Local law enforcement identified potential threats, followed proper protocols, and enabled us to address both training objectives and real security concerns simultaneously. Colonel, I have to ask, was any of this planned, or did we just get incredibly lucky? She smiled with the same measured expression he remembered from their first encounter. Agent Wells, in our line of work, we make our own luck by being prepared for situations that haven't happened yet. Sheriff Morrison's training in military-civilian protocols turned what could have been a disaster into a successful operation. As Wells flew back to Washington that night, he reflected on how much the network had grown. From one arrest at a main shooting range, they had developed protocols that now operated along the entire eastern seaboard. Local law enforcement officers knew how to recognize potential military operations, when to call for federal coordination, and how to maintain security without compromising legitimate activities. His phone buzzed with a message from an unlisted number. Outstanding work today. The network you've built saved both operations and lives. Looking forward to our next challenge. Wells smiled, knowing that somewhere in America, elite operators were conducting missions that required perfect coordination between military and civilian authorities. The system they had built ensured that such coordination was possible, professional, and effective. The network was working exactly as designed. 5 years after the incident that changed everything, Agent Wells stood once again at Frank Sullivan's shooting range in Beacon Harbor, Maine. But this time, he wasn't investigating a mysterious woman with impossible marksmanship skills. He was conducting the final evaluation of a program that had revolutionized military-civilian law enforcement cooperation across the United States. Frank greeted him at the door with the warm handshake of an old friend. "Marcus, good to see you." "Again. Heard you made it all the way to Deputy Director of the Military Liaison Program. Thanks to you recognizing that something wasn't right about Commander Hayes 5 years ago. Your instincts started everything we've built since then." The shooting range looked exactly the same, but Wells knew that beneath the surface, everything had changed. Frank's facility had become the unofficial training center for the liaison program, where local law enforcement officers learned to recognize signs of military operations and where military personnel learned to work effectively with civilian authorities. "Frank, before we begin the evaluation, I need to ask any regrets about getting involved in all this." Frank chuckled, the same sound Wells remembered from their first meeting. "Marcus, I spent 20 years in submarines learning that the most important missions are the ones nobody ever hears about. Being part of this network, It's the most meaningful work I've done since leaving the Navy. Over the past 5 years, the Military-Civilian Law Enforcement Liaison Program had prevented 17 potential confrontations between local police and special operations units, facilitated 43 joint training exercises, and contributed to the successful resolution of 8 actual security threats. The protocols developed after the Commander Hayes incident had become the standard for military-civilian cooperation nationwide. Wells's phone buzzed with an encrypted message. Evaluation. Team arriving in 30 minutes. Final test subject is someone you'll recognize. 30 minutes later, a black SUV pulled into the range parking lot. Colonel Alexandra Hayes stepped out, followed by 2 other officers Wells didn't recognize. But it was the 4th person who made him smile, a young woman in civilian clothes whose movement patterns immediately caught his attention. Agent Wells, Colonel Hayes said, approaching with her familiar combination of authority and warmth. Meet Lieutenant Sarah Parker, one of our newest Special Operations officers. She'll be conducting today's evaluation exercise. Lieutenant. Parker looked remarkably similar to how Commander Hayes had appeared 5 years earlier, deliberately unremarkable appearance, casual civilian clothes, and the same careful bearing that suggested hidden capabilities. But unlike Hayes, who had been conducting a real operation, Parker was here for training. Lieutenant Parker, Wells said, shaking her hand, your mission today is to conduct a marksmanship assessment while maintaining your civilian cover identity. Frank Sullivan will be observing as our range safety officer, and I'll be playing the role of local law enforcement, responding to reports of unusual activity. Understood, sir. What are the success criteria? Maintain operational security while demonstrating your capabilities. Respond appropriately to law enforcement contact, and coordinate with proper authorities to resolve any misunderstandings, without compromising your cover or the mission. As Lieutenant Parker began her exercise, Wells observed with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent 5 years studying the intersection of military operations and civilian law enforcement. Her shooting was exceptional, not quite at Colonel Hayes' level, but impressive enough to draw attention. More importantly, she was following the protocols that had been developed to prevent the kind of situation that had led to Hayes' arrest. After 2 hours of shooting, Wells approached Parker's position in his role as investigating officer. Excuse me, ma'am. I'm Agent Wells with NCIS. I'd like to ask you a few questions about your activities here today. Parker set down her rifle and turned to face him, her response immediate and professional. Agent Wells, I'm Lieutenant Sarah Parker, conducting training exercises under Operation Blue Water protocols. Here are my verification codes. Wells accepted the authentication information, noting how smoothly Parker had transitioned from cover identity to official status. The protocols now required military personnel to carry special identification that could be verified through secure channels, preventing the communication breakdowns that had led to Hayes' arrest. Lieutenant Parker, I'll need to verify these codes with headquarters. Please secure your equipment and stand by. Yes, sir. Wells made the verification call, following procedures that were now routine for military-civilian encounters. Within minutes, headquarters confirmed Parker's status and authorized continuation of her training exercise. Lieutenant, you're cleared to continue your exercise. Excellent work on the proper identification protocols. As the formal evaluation concluded, Colonel Hayes joined Wells and Frank Sullivan for the final debriefing. Agent Wells, how do you assess the current state of the liaison program? Colonel, 5 years ago you were arrested because our systems weren't designed to handle military-civilian intersections. Today, Lieutenant Parker conducted the same type of exercise without any confusion or confrontation. The protocols work. Frank nodded in agreement. I've seen dozens of exercises here over the past 2 years. Everyone has gone smoothly because everyone knows their role and follows the established procedures. Colonel Hayes studied the range where her own arrest had begun 5 years earlier. Agent Wells, when I was detained here, I had to choose between compromising an 18-month operation and trusting that our system would eventually work properly. It was one of the most difficult decisions of my career, but it led to something better, Wells replied. Your willingness to maintain cover despite personal cost created the case study that convinced everyone this program was necessary. The irony is that my arrest probably saved more lives in the long run than my original mission did. Operation Silent Harbor prevented one terrorist attack, but this liaison program has prevented dozens of potential conflicts and improved military-civilian cooperation across the entire country. As the evaluation team prepared to leave, Lieutenant Parker approached Wells privately. Agent Wells, I read the case files about Commander Hayes' arrest. I can't imagine maintaining cover under that kind of pressure. Lieutenant, people like Colonel Hayes makes sacrifices most of us can't comprehend. Your job is to learn from her experience and be prepared to make similar decisions if necessary. Do you think situations like hers will happen again? Wells considered the question carefully. I hope not. But if they do, we now have systems in place to handle them properly. The network we've built ensures that the next time someone like Colonel Hayes needs to maintain cover, they won't have to choose between their mission and their freedom. As the vehicles departed, Frank and Wells stood together watching the sunset over the Maine coast. The shooting range looked peaceful in the fading light, giving no indication of the events that had transformed American military-civilian cooperation. Frank, any final thoughts on how this all turned out? Marcus, 5 years ago, I thought I was just reporting suspicious activity at my shooting range. Today I learned that we've built something that protects both military operations and civilian law enforcement across the entire country. Frank paused, then smiled. Some things are worth more than we realize when they're happening. Wells's phone buzzed with a final message. Thank you for building something that makes impossible choices unnecessary. The network you created ensures that future operators won't face the same dilemmas I did. Mission accomplished. As Wells drove away from Beacon Harbor for what might be the last time in his official capacity, he reflected on the unexpected path that had brought him here. From arresting a Navy SEAL to building a national security program, from small-town detective to deputy director of military-civilian cooperation. The woman he had handcuffed at a shooting range had become one of America's most decorated special operations officers. The range safety officer who had noticed something unusual had become a key trainer in military-civilian protocols. And he had found his calling in the complex intersection where military operations and civilian law enforcement met. Somewhere in America, elite operators were conducting missions that required them to work in civilian spaces, maintain cover identities, and coordinate with local authorities. Because of what they had built together, those operators would never have to choose between their missions and their freedom. The system worked. The network was complete. And America was safer because a detective had been willing to arrest someone he didn't understand. A range officer had trusted his instincts, and a Navy SEAL had been willing to maintain her cover, even at the cost of her own liberty. Sometimes the most important victories are the ones that prevent future defeats. Sometimes the greatest success is ensuring that extraordinary courage won't be necessary again. The mission was accomplished. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.